to the Boca Podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Holritz, and it is good to have you here today. We're doing 4 live streams this week, and this is number 2. And I'm really, really excited about this for multiple reasons, actually. I'm going to introduce our brand new guest here in just a second, but a couple of quick housekeeping notes before we get started. For those of you that may be live streaming on YouTube or on Facebook, don't be shy. Join the conversation today. Don't hesitate to say hello, ask questions. You can send us funny emojis if you want to, but be part of the conversation. We'd love to have you part of the conversation. And then for those of you that are listening to the audio version of this, after the fact, don't be shy either. Come back, join us, hang out for these live streams. We're on YouTube and Facebook at Boca Podcast. And if you follow us on Instagram at Boca Podcast, BOKEH Podcast, on Instagram, you can keep up to date with the latest upcoming live streams. So come join us, hang out with us, and be part of the conversation. Would love to have you here. And then, last quick note, as I promised before every episode, I made a donation to Charity Water. I pop up the receipt there on screen. But this is just an encouragement to everybody, and yet again, a reminder for myself to continue to look for opportunities to give back, whether it's to our local community, national, international organizations. Let's take advantage of opportunities to give. All right. Well, I would love to introduce our brand new guest who is here with me today. Lisa Aihara is here with me. Lisa, thank you for hanging out with us on the podcast today.
Oh my goodness, thank you so much for having me. Very excited.
Well, me too, and it's truly a privilege to have you here. We were actually chatting, getting to know each other a little bit before we got started, and then also briefly talking about the topic that we're going to get into today. We're going to talk about branding, which we talk about quite a bit here on the podcast, but we're looking at it from a little bit of a different angle, and your strong opinion on the infusion of personality or persona into the brand, which I'm excited to dig into. So we're going to get to that here in just a little bit, but talk to us a little bit about your specialty. It's not very often that we have a guest on the podcast who's not a photographer as their primary specialty. So share with us your brand position and what you do as a business.
Yeah, of course. So I'm a strategic brand designer, and I help entrepreneurs grow their business by getting them to stop hiding behind generic branding and instead make an emotional connection with their customers through a branding that looks like them and no one else. And I love that you introduced me as a brand new guest because I'm also a sucker for puns.
Fair play. Well done. I totally went over my head. So yeah, good catch there. But I as you're talking about your brand, I want to go ahead and share, and I've pulled up your website here on screen for everybody who is live streaming. Ellet Studio. Am I pronouncing that correctly, Lisa?
That's right. It rhymes with baguette.
Okay. And you've probably had to say that a few times. ELLETTE and then studio.com. We'll link to this in the show notes at bocapodcast.com for everybody listening in and watching. And I'll go ahead and mention as well Ellet Studio on Instagram. Make sure you follow Lisa there as well. But Lisa, to your point, and I love this, one of the things we talk about is the significance of brand position above the fold, where everybody can see it immediately when they come to your site, and you've got it right there. Branding that looks like you and no one else. And talk to me a little bit about how you came up with that position statement.
Yeah, so a lot of the work that I do is sort of hand-drawn, right? So you could kind of see behind me too. I'm an artist by trade. I do hand lettering. So one thing that I really wanted to hone in on as my style and what I do that's different is that everything is handmade and it's uniquely you. And I think that as entrepreneurs, one of really the biggest things that makes us different from our competitors is us, right? And our own personality and how that's reflected in the branding. So that's kind of why I wanted to make sure that everyone knows these are stuff that's not manufactured or mass produced or, just fonts out of the box. It's going to look like you and no one else.
That's beautiful. Okay. And I hadn't put 2 and 2 together. So that work behind you represents kind of brainstorming for the sake of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, so this is all like past stuff that I've done, little illustrations. I come from a wedding background, so I used to do wedding stationery, and that's sort of how I got into the art bit of it. Before that, in my past life, I was doing digital marketing, and this was sort of the creative avenue that I had. Okay. And yeah, it's all kind of coming full circle where I get to bring in my MBA background, the art stuff that I like to do, and yeah, coming all together.
It's beautiful. And that's really, really cool, actually. And by the way, I'm just noticing the colors, and I'll go full screen on you again so everybody can see. If to your, I guess it would be to your right behind you, you've got that color palette that matches the color palette on your website. And I'll pull that up here really quick so everybody can see. But that's really cool just to see firsthand that work that you're doing.
Yeah, so this became a pattern for the website, and yeah, it's kind of these are like my happy colors. I really believe in the power of color,
Mm,
especially when it comes to branding. So I love that it's around me all the time.
that's really cool. Okay, I know we could park there for a long time. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to
Yeah.
transition to kind of a different type of question. Talk to me about customer experience. Of course, this
Ooh.
is an element of running a business that is it's something we all share, regardless of whether it's a photography business or a branding studio or otherwise. What is the driving factor or big idea behind the customer experience that you provide for your clients?
I think, like you were saying, photographers can relate to this too. What we do is a people business, right? We're service providers. And I think one of the proudest moments that I have when running my business is when I get referrals. And that I've been very lucky to have a lot of my work coming in as referrals. And being that person that my past clients could sort of entrust their friends to is the ultimate compliment. And that's what I strive for.
Hmm.
And that only comes from great customer experience, right? Like, even if we deliver something amazing, if the experience was awful, like, no one's going to refer you. And that makes it a smart business move
Hmm.
and also, like, a way to be a decent human being,
Yeah.
which another thing we could strive for.
Side note, that might be something good that we should all be doing. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, just a little thought starter there. Be
Yeah.
decent.
Okay, so give me an example, like a tangible example of something that you do regularly in interaction with your clients that helps bring those word of mouth referrals.
I try to treat and I think it's like a mindset thing for me. Treating every project, whether I knew them before or not, as if I am working with a friend, right? And those come in place in little things like don't get annoyed if someone texts you a question. Like, instead, be really, really, helpful with that. Answering questions with that sort of kindness and
Mm.
coming from a place of like helping
Hmm.
instead of, oh my God, like, what is she talking about? Or like, oh, another email that I have to answer. It's always like, oh, every interaction becomes a conversation, becomes an opportunity to serve. And I
Yeah.
think that really translates into a much better experience.
Well, and a bit ironically, or maybe not so ironically, not just for the client, but for us too, right? It's that mentality. If we go into it with cynicism and annoyance and frustration to begin with, it sets a whole different tone, not only for the client, but for us, the
Yeah.
experience that we have serving the client.
Yeah, I think they call it like what is it, like enlightened self-interest, right? When
Hmm.
you are doing something for yourself, it also serves your customers. One example that I remember was with like Arrowhead water bottles. They had released a bottle. I think they were one of the first ones to do a like 40% recycled material or something like
Hmm.
that. And that became like a really big marketing point for them, but it also saved them money when you're using recycled material. So just because it's serving you doesn't mean that it's not serving the customer, and vice versa. And I think that
Yeah.
when you approach every experience like that, it becomes like a lot easier to keep up too, because no one wants to do anything that's like a shit show and a half for you to
Yeah.
have to do.
No,
Yeah.
it's a great point. And I just saw a clip today somewhere on social media, and the person was talking about how there is a tendency for people to be miserable doing the thing that they feel like they have to do, right?
Yeah.
And this is stereotypically played out in the corporate world in particular, where people feel like they're just going in, checking in, doing a job, going home. It doesn't really have any relevance to them. They're just trying to make a little bit of money, pay the bills, and they feel like they're
Mm.
having to do it. The moment we shift the mindset from we have to do this thing to I get to do this thing. There's a friend of mine, Sean Austin, who talks about this quite a bit. I think it really makes a difference. Again, not only in the attitude that we bring to the customer experience, but then also our experience as business owners. So I'm glad you brought this up. It's a great reminder.
Totally. I love that.
So shifting gears yet again, talk to me about
Mm.
time management, balancing the world of business ownership and then having a life for yourself and the important people in your life. What does that look like? How do you go about that?
Yeah, this one is a big one for me too because I'm a work at home mom. I have no childcare, but I have a 3-year-old and a 10-month-old baby. So I don't have
Goodness.
any time. Oh my God, I
Wow.
know. I don't know. I don't know how I'm alive. So one thing that I've sort of learned along the way is it's all about prioritizing.
Mm.
And that's sort of worked for me, like breaking down, right? Like my yearly goal into a monthly, weekly, daily bits so that I can know the difference between something that is just a task versus something that's going to be a move that puts me a step towards building something, and then kind of working accordingly and planning my day accordingly.
And I think that's a really key thing. And it may seem simplistic to those that are listening in or watching, but the idea of focusing on the tasks that we know will move our business even an inch or two, those proactive tasks, the work that actually helps our business grow, focusing, kind of weighting our efforts and our time and energy on those things, it really makes a big difference. And again, not just in moving our business forward, but to our earlier conversation and enabling us, allowing us to enjoy the work a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah, because those are usually the stuff that gets us excited, right?
Yeah, right. But and then the flip side of that, I think too, is the reality of running a business, which is occasionally there's some busy work that has to be done. But I'm curious, we talk quite a bit about outsourcing, delegation, and the photography industry. As a branding studio owner, is delegation? Is that a concept that you've practiced at all or experimented with as a business owner?
Not at the moment yet, just because I also enjoy some of the admin stuff. For me, because my personal life is so chaotic, having those tasks within my business that is a little bit mind-numbing, if you will, and kind of like busy work, does put me in a certain mindset, I think, that does help to focus on other things. But I think, delegating stuff that I don't want to do anymore, if ever those tasks become energy sucks, then those will be the first things to go, for sure.
That makes sense. Okay, switching gears yet again, and then we're going to get into branding conversation here. But talk to me about a favorite business book, self-help book, maybe both if you'd like, that comes to mind, a recommendation you would want to make to our audience.
Yeah, everything Brene Brown. She is the closest thing to self-help that I've read, and she is just absolutely brilliant. I think I saw that you guys had Daring Greatly and Dare to Lead was on your bookshelf, I believe. So I wanted to throw in the OG, The Power of Vulnerability, which is technically not a book. It's a recording of one of her seminars, I believe. But I love that she gives vocabulary to what we intuitively know through living the human experience. But she lays it out in a way that allows us to talk about it, right? Because she gives us words for it. And she's an absolutely brilliant speaker. She's lovely to listen to. So I would totally throw that in.
Now, this is interesting to me, and I think it's actually going to be a really good segue to our conversation about branding and talking about the significance of personality in branding. But you strike me, Lisa, and I don't know you very well. We just met today, but you strike me as somebody like who is super practical, no bullshit, like just calls it as it is. And I like that. I like that about people. I'm trying to be more of that myself in some ways, I guess. But to that extent, I think it's one of the things that I've had a hard time with about Brene is that I feel like when I listen to her speak, and I haven't read her books, and this is largely why, to be honest, when I hear her speak, I feel like she's trying to work through stuff as she's speaking. Like a lot of her own issues are kind of coming out in the conversation. And I realize the value of that, the significance of that, and kind of making herself relevant to the people she's speaking to. But I also feel like I'm having to kind of carry her baggage while I'm listening to her give advice about those same issues. And it seems kind of, I don't know, I have a hard time with it. What are your thoughts about that?
That's really interesting. I guess it's the difference, right, in the way that we view people who are giving us information. And what I'm taking away from that is that you enjoy, or you would like to get information from someone who has that sort of distance, maybe, and authority, right, with like a podium of respect in between. And with, I guess, the way that I see Brene Brown is exactly the way you're kind of talking about. And I like that she's sort of participating in it with me. It almost feels like, like what we're doing. It's a conversation. It's, feels real. And it feels like she's not approaching it completely clinically or just theoretically, and that these are real things and tangible things, and that she's almost demonstrating. And so that's why I kind of like that. So it's really interesting, though, that's a take that you have on that. It's interesting.
Interesting is a very kind way to put it.
No, it is, though. And I think you might like her book because she's, obviously like written them down, and she does read the way she speaks, but in a more storytelling way, where she has it sort of, or the narrative laid out a little bit better.
That makes sense. Yeah, I guess maybe I'm too idealistic, or maybe there's some other issues, but when I hear somebody, like the people that I tend to, I guess, have more respect for are the ones that are standing up there and do have a sense of authority. And I don't think that they're perfect or they have it all put together, but
Yeah.
they at least give a sense that they have figured some things out and they've kind of got their stuff together. And I'm hearing from somebody who has figured enough out that it makes sense that they're telling me that I should go do these things. And that experience with Brene has been different. And I guess that's what's made me apprehensive about that brand. But you're right. I guess that is the value in Brene, is that she is vulnerable and relevant to those that she's speaking to, simultaneously has learned something through that and is able to share.
Yeah, and that's, the difference in sort of brand messaging too, and which is a nice little segue.
It is a perfect segue.
Today.
Yeah. I'm glad it worked out this way. So let's get to that. And we're going to talk, for those of you listening in who may be chiming in a little bit later, and we have some of those who are live streaming with us on YouTube or Facebook or both. And you all, please don't hesitate to chime in and ask Lisa questions as we go along or comment along the way. But Lisa, we're going to talk about the infusion of personality in branding. And this is an interesting topic to me, and I love that you're the one I'm talking to about this, because again, I love your persona, your personality, the way that you approach conversation. Leading up to our conversation today, you had mentioned discussing how you like to help people infuse personality in design, positioning, messaging for the sake of emotional connection with customers. Yeah. And this is, it's an interesting topic to me because I've actually been in the industry long enough, the photography industry specifically, to actually see the move into placing importance or significance on personality and the personal brand element. Yeah. And at the same time, I get the sense, especially in the last few years, that there's been this move to an extreme side of that, where there's so much kind of fluff that it gets in the way of just getting to the point, speaking about value proposition for the sake of the client, not forcing them to spend 15 minutes reading through stuff that really is irrelevant to what it is that they're looking for. So I'm curious just to kind of get your initial take on that, I guess, that trajectory and where we're at the moment, and what does a healthy balance look like?
Yeah, I love that you bring that up, because that's definitely sort of been the specific trend, I think. And, the reason why that works for some people is because that is their brand. And it just so happens to match, that style, right? Okay. But not everyone is like that. Like, if you're a naturally shy person, for example, like having, a brand that seems like your guns blazing, like super casual, like, oh, I love charcuterie boards and, I have a messy bun, like, is not going to work, because those are not the types of things that you would talk about, say, if you were having a regular conversation with someone, right? And so infusing your personality into your brand means doing it in a way that is sort of driving your strategy, right? There's a difference between having your personality drive your strategy versus just talking about yourself, which is sort of what you're alluding to, just having this laundry list of cute little details about yourself. Okay,
I wish we could just and we will actually, we're going to go back and we're going to clip that line that you just said, because I think it's so beautifully summed up. That the significance of strategy first, and now that guides the way that we kind of combine the call to action, the attempt to actually convert a potential client through a clear value proposition, and of course the infusion of personality. I think it's so important though that is established first, and you kind of glazed over it, but that's a gem, absolute gem.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. So, let's try to change that perspective where, you're not just writing that you love charcuterie boards for the sake of writing it. Like, maybe it manifests instead in a way where you're talking about your love for connection or for gathering with friends, right? That's maybe what you love about charcuterie boards and how that could drive your strategy, instead of just telling people about that. Or the messy bun thing could be about, being a mom and not having time to spend on yourself, but you would rather serve clients. Like, those are the kinds of things where if that is your strategy, then that's a detail that will help to drive that. But if that's not your brand positioning, instead you have a positioning of, I have my stuff together, like, I'm here as an expert to serve you, then messy buns and charcuterie would be out the door, right? So that's right. So that's kind of the difference between, infusing personality or being cute for the sake of just being cute, or, vulnerable for the sake of just talking about what a mess you are and how that's amazing. like that works for my brand, because that's sort of the positioning that I have, right? Like, I like to approach my clients as a friend, as someone who is going to be there with them and have that connection. So that works for me, but that's not going to work for everybody. And that's okay because
Mm.
that's not who you are.
But I guess our earlier conversation
Hmm.
about Brene, I don't feel when I'm interacting like you. I love that you're just as you are. You kind of say it as it is, call it as you think. But I don't feel like I'm carrying the weight of your baggage. Whereas
Mm.
what I see in our industry quite a bit is, to your point, kind of people putting stuff out there, being quote unquote vulnerable for the sake of being vulnerable, and
Yeah.
it really feels at that point more like an attention grab than
Mm.
anything else. And so
Hmm. Hmm.
I love this balance that you're suggesting, which is all right. Let's be clear first what it is that we're trying to actually accomplish with our brand.
Yeah.
And then we can decide how to kind of balance that infusion of personality with a clear call to action and make sure that they work together for the sake of the overarching goals. I think that's just a
Hmm.
great balance.
Yeah, and when you have strategy drive it, then you're able to make that distinction of, am I just talking about myself here? Or am I saying something that is going to serve my client and let them know that I'm the person for them?
We got a comment on Facebook from Kala. She says, I'm excited for this topic. I'm a big advocate of infusing your brand with your personality. I find it helps attract my target demographic, ideal client, and it's much more true to me. So I don't feel like I'm putting on a facade when I represent myself. Listening intently to you, Lisa. Thanks for listening,
Oh,
Kala.
thank you. Oh my God, I love that she talks about the facade because we do tend to do that, right? I want to say that it's might be like a reaction to like the whole imposter syndrome thing where we like
Hmm.
stand a little bit taller, like pinky up, like put on our business owner outfit almost,
Yeah.
which again works for some people. Some people are very professional when they're approaching their business, some people are not. And I think the big part about infusing your personality is showing up as the person that you are and not the person that you think you have to be. Whether that have to be becomes the overly professional or the overly casual. Like if neither of them are you, then it's not going to work for you.
So when we talk about looking for this combination of personality and then
Hmm.
a clear brand position, which we talked about your brand position earlier, is pretty straightforward. Is should we be trying to combine those two in the actual messaging and the copy, or do we have a brand position and then mix our personality into the rest of the site? What does that actually look like practically?
So practically, I think that it because so I come from a language background, so I was a literature and writing major, and so like language and words are
Hmm.
like a really big part for me.
Okay.
So I think it's really in understanding the vocabulary, right? So every word kind of counts, like whether you are using specific words to describe your unique value proposition, how you're describing your customers, using that thesaurus to find that perfect word is I think what's going to help you drive right that balance and finding out the way that you talk about yourself
Okay.
because the language is literally the tool that we use to do that. So even something like the difference between fun and playful, right, joyful and happy, like those all have very specific connotations to it, and understanding that and understanding which words describe your brand I think is going to help you sort of write those mission statements, write those website copies, and understand that specific point of view that you bring into your business. And I think that's like the critical piece of that.
Okay. So a couple of questions along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
One, you mentioned a thesaurus. I'm a regular user of thesauruses. There's one in
Love
particular
it.
called powerthesaurus,
Ooh.
.org. I think it's just a quick website search, and we can link to that in the show notes for anybody listening in.
Yeah.
But I just found it super helpful the various options that it gives me when I search for a particular word because I'm like you. I'm very much keyed into words. Not only the words that I write, for example, for our site or various brands, but even the words that I say. I'm super intentional about that, and I think
Mm.
that's really important. How do photographers, because there's a tendency in the photography industry to use a lot of the same words, like you could probably find 20-25 words that are mixed in some form or fashion to brand positions or some form of brand position statement on photographers, 80% of photographers websites, let's just say, throwing
Mm-hmm.
a number out there. So how can they proactively go about using tools like a thesaurus to make sure that they're not saying a lot of the same thing that other photographers, whether in their market or otherwise?
I think, an exercise that you can do sometimes, this happens with art too, like copying something is actually the first step to finding out what your own style is. So list out the value propositions that maybe you think you're copying and pasting from other people
Okay.
and rewrite it using a thesaurus, right? Like take these specific words, find a word that fits you better, and then say it out loud. Like you would be surprised how many people have these website copies that they would never ever be caught dead saying with their own voice,
Right,
right? So
right.
so if you say it out loud and it feels weird, like that's not your voice,
Yeah.
like literally.
Yes.
So rewrite other people's value propositions, make it your style, and then as you're kind of doing that exercise, I think you'll realize what you're changing, what feels more like you, and you'll see where you are reflected in that.
That's great. Super practical. And I really appreciate that suggestion. Okay. So I want to go to brand design. We're kind of jumping around
Okay.
a little bit. I really appreciate your commentary on that I think a really healthy balance between personality and clear calls to action and position statements. Let's talk about the building blocks of brand design. You mentioned to us ahead of time that there are 4 building blocks, and I'd love for you to share those with our listeners, kind of explain what they mean.
Yeah, so the 4 are logo, colors, fonts, and photos. I like to throw in patterns and illustrations as a nice bonus just to make your life easier. But honestly, if you have those 4, you are good to go and you can have a very strong, cohesive, professional, put together design. And you would be surprised to hear that logo is actually not the most important part.
Hmm.
I don't think.
Okay.
Really, color and photos have a much bigger sort of visual weight to them. And I think with photographers, you guys have a really good advantage where color and photos are like your jam, right? Like that's kind of built in with the stuff that you do.
Yeah.
And that is going to be used more often. And if you have a strong vision there, you are going to be fine.
Okay, so you said logo tends to not be as important as people think. I think for photographers, maybe one of the reasons that we put a lot of weight on logos or have over the years is because we are such visual individuals. And so this thing that's going to represent our brand, in addition to our pretty photos, we better have a pretty logo. That's maybe kind of the thought process, right? But why would you say it carries less weight than some may expect?
So when we're talking about the way that your branding actually manifests, like it's, say your Instagram feed or on your website, and you are not going to have your logo on every post all the time. Your logo is at the top of your website, but the rest of it, right, is graphics and images and copy. Like the logo is almost like a person's face. If we're talking about the branding as a person, the logo is the face. So obviously most recognizable, right? Like you think of the person with that face, and it's really important to have that be strong. But if you have a pretty face and you're kind of like wearing awful clothes, or you're like a nightmare to work with, or your voice is really off-putting, then you're not going to have a great visual experience.
Okay.
In that same way, I think that a logo is important, but having those other parts sort of carry it together is when you have the most successful branding design.
Well, yeah, when I think about the website, it really is such a small percentage. Even on the homepage, you land on the homepage above the fold, that little tiny logo is such a small percentage of what people are actually looking at. So that makes
Yeah.
sense too, practically. I know we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about colors here in just a second, so we'll come back to that. Font. This is a big one, and again, I think photographers. And by the way, I was super guilty of it. My first photography brand company and business was called Expressive Photography.
Ooh.
And I wish I should have prepped this so I could share it with everybody. But funny, that laughable name looking back on it now, but even funnier was the font that we used to represent that brand. It was this super scripty, kind of like old
Oh.
time scripty. Exactly. I love these fonts. It was terrible. But anyway, all this to say, photographers still, I think, are making the mistake of using fonts that aren't super legible when somebody lands on their site, and some may have to kind of squint their eyes a little bit to read that font. What's your take on font, the significance of font as it relates to branding?
So font is, right, literally the tool that you use when you're talking about yourself, especially in a digital space like that. So you have to be able to read it. And from a practical perspective, honestly, if you can read it, it could be anything. It just has to be
Okay.
consistent.
Okay.
Is the big thing for me. Have no more than 2 fonts. I think a
Yeah.
lot of photographers starting out, like they're like, oh, I have like the scripty one and this one and this one, and
Yep.
you kind of have it all over the place, which makes it look mishmashed. Just have one for a headline and
Hmm.
one for a body text,
Yep.
and call it a day. It could be a serif, sans serif. There's different fonts that give you different sort of feelings to it, which what you feel from a font is going to be consistent with what your customers see too. So just pick 2 that feel right to you. And something that is a really good resource is Google Fonts, because you know that those fonts are going to be available across the board. You
Yeah.
can even download them for free. Like,
Yes.
there is no reason why you have to pay a lot for fonts. There's a lot of good free ones, so you can
It's
just grab one of those, call
Yeah,
it a
it
day.
is a massive library. That's a great recommendation, actually. There's a new brand that we're in the process of developing, and
Ooh.
we've used font from Google Fonts for that
Mm-hmm.
very brand. And yeah, to
Mm-hmm.
not have to go spend $100 or $200 or $300 to go pay for a license for a font, it's so nice. So yeah, anybody listening in, if you're not familiar with it, you can literally Google Fonts, or we can link to it in the show notes as well at bokehpodcast.com. It'll be another great resource. And then photos. Before we get back to color, photos. Any particular recommendations for photographers? I know photographers a lot of times will probably be like, I know what I think looks best, and that's what I'm gonna put there on the site. But just from a practical standpoint, considering brand, do you have specific
Mm-hmm.
recommendations?
My photographer friend told me this, which I thought was a really, really good example on how to pick the font. If you bought a billboard out, on the freeway that's going to have your name next to it, what photo would you use? So that's really the way that you should approach selecting your hero photos.
Mm.
I think that it makes sense, because you're a photographer, to have a photo almost be like a logo, where you have that one that you kind of slap everywhere, right? It's the hero image on your website. It's the image that's going to be on the cover of your lead magnet, or, on the top of your invoice or something like that, and have that also carry some of that recognizability weight to it.
That makes
And I
sense.
think, yeah, something that feels like you. It's your calling card. Like,
Mm.
and having that one, and then, having a library maybe of about 5 or 10 that you use all the time, I think is going to make your life a lot easier when you're making graphics for yourself.
Yeah, that's true. I do like to make life easier for myself. And I have
Yeah.
a tendency of creating those kind of, it's almost like creating an email template, right? You can go and pull it very quickly and use it.
Mm-hmm.
Having a library that I would suggest to photographers that they update regularly, maybe every
Sure.
3 to 6 months or so, just update that
Totally.
library, but have a group of photos that they can quickly go to pull for ads or otherwise. I think that's a great recommendation. Okay, so let's go back to colors.
Okay.
The top 3 ideas that you
Ooh.
would suggest photographers consider when it comes to choosing the right colors for their brand.
Of course. So one is a good color palette, right? So I think that when you have a good and well-designed palette, all the colors together create this emotional experience, right? It's not the simple like blue equals calm of color psychology, which was very trendy, and it is kind of helpful, but think of it more like an Olympic bobsled team. Like, each of the colors in your palette has a role, and you need them all, and you need them sort of playing off of each other to make a really good experience for your customers when they're looking at it.
And what does it look like for a photographer who probably, like, if
Mm-hmm.
you go to a website, there are any number of websites. I was actually pulling this up here. The one that I've used recently is called Coolors,
Ooh.
Coolors. Have you heard of that before?
Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. I love that site.
.co. They've got a
Mm-hmm.
really great mobile app as well. And again, we'll link to all this in the show notes for those listening and watching. But it could be overwhelming, right? I mean, you kind of have this
Mm-hmm.
endless set of options to go. How do they effectively narrow down? The photographers are like, you know what, I need to update my brand colors, but I don't know where to start. What does that look like practically?
So for specifically for photographers, because these colors are always going to live with your photos, I think the easiest way to go about it is to let your photos take the lead when you're choosing your colors. Like, is there a specific way that you edit your photos? Do you punch up some colors? Do you tone down other colors? Is there an environment that you shoot at often? Like, are you, out in the forest all the time? Then, like, you want something that pulls the grain or works with the grain. And considering those things when you're picking your colors will make sure that your work is highlighted in the most beautiful way. So I think an easy way to build a color palette of 5 colors, pick one signature brand color. That's going to be the color that you use when in doubt and slap it everywhere. 2 colors that are going to be playing nicely with those colors. So you call them sort of colors that are similar and close to each other on the color wheel, right? So if it's a blue, then a green is next to it, a purple is next to it. So 2 colors that work well with that. One accent color, that's going to be like the punch, right? Something that feels like it's going to stand out against your signature brand color. And then one neutral. Call it a day.
And I've got your site pulled up here again on screen,
Yeah.
and that color palette, that of course, is also behind you. What you just described, was that essentially the process that you went through in picking these colors?
So for me, just because it's a little bit different when you have to brand as a branding studio, right? Because you're like, oh, I have to make sure that people can imagine my work as their own. So it's a little bit more like varied, where I
Okay.
do have like a rainbow of colors. And the five easy color palette that I described is the way that you, as a person who's DIYing their brand, can easily foolproof choose your brand colors. It's a little bit different too when I'm working with my clients. Some people have a smaller color palette because they have a very specific point of view when it comes to the visuals. And other people work better with a bigger color palette because they're colorful, vibrant, maybe they're a content creator and they don't want everything to look really styled and really forced. And so they might have a wider palette to work with. So it kind of depends from person to person. But for the
Okay.
most part, if you're a photographer, and you have these photos that are beautiful, having a simple 5 color palette is going to serve you amazingly.
And I've noticed too, and again, I'm going to pull up your website and compare it
Yeah.
with your Instagram profile, because I noticed you've got the colors there on the homepage of your site, and then those carry over to your Instagram profile and the highlights here on your Instagram profile. And I mean, consistency is so important in general when it comes to branding. Will you comment on that just a little bit?
Yeah, of course, because branding, if we're kind of defining it, right, is the process where you try to be distinct within your marketplace and also consistent in a way where your customers will never be confused when they see something. Like, they know. It's like a good example is like, if you see that Facebook blue, you're on Facebook, right? Like, you're not going to be confused what website you are on. In the same way that the Pinterest owns that red, and so on and so forth. So wherever that you can infuse your branding design, whether it's through color, it's through icons, through your photos, you want to sort of slap that everywhere to make sure that anybody looking at it won't ever be confused on who they're looking at.
Fair enough. I guess last question for you, and this is a really interesting one too. I like that we've kind of hit a variety of elements of
Yeah.
branding. You talk about the importance of boiling down a brand position for the sake of, or I guess ultimately boiling down a brand position and developing keywords that guide decision making. And I don't think this is something that most photographers naturally thinking about. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, so I love brand keywords. Again, like we were saying, language is such a big part of what I do. And with my clients, what I do is boil down their brand vision into 5 brand keywords. I like the number 5, if you
Okay.
haven't noticed. um, and what this does is it sort of guides your decisions, because so much of what we do, especially when you're kind of picking design stuff or even when you're making a business decision, I think we get caught up in like preferences, right? Or comparison instead of strategy, right? Like, oh, I like this template, so I'm going to get it. Or like, oh, I should get into family portraits because everyone and their mother is now doing family portraits, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But when you boil it down to these keywords, it's an easy way to sort of reference your strategy, your brand vision, and kind of check yourself against that. So what they are from a actual practical logistical point of view is adjectives that describe you, your core values, how you want your customers to describe you and your business or your work, how they feel when they work with you. Those are the kind of things that should be included. And I always recommend with my customers or with my clients to put up these keywords somewhere that you can see them. Actually, mine is over here on the side that's sort of out of frame, but so that you can always reference them and know whether you're doing something that matches up with it. So for me, it's playful, unexpected, friendly, hooray, and pretty. And that kind of just encapsulates everything that I try to do.
Okay, before you keep going, do you
Yeah.
mind holding that up still a little bit
Oh, yeah,
more?
of course.
Especially now that I was cringing a little bit as I heard it ripping as you were pulling it off the wall.
Oh, no, it's okay. It's just painter's tape.
Okay,
on the
good.
back.
So will you comment just briefly on how you chose those particular words and how it's a reflection of you and your brand?
Yeah. Of course. So playful. I don't like to take things seriously, and if you haven't noticed from this interview,
Yeah,
I'm not a very serious person.
I love it.
So I have that unexpected. I love having with my design and with my work having these combinations and things offsetting things. Like, oh, you thought this color palette was very girly. Well, let's throw in this like shade of blue that's gonna balance it out. And I love having those sort of combination. So that sort of speaks a little bit to my work. Friendly, the way that I want to give the best sort of customer experience
Mm.
with my clients,
Hmm.
right? Like being friendly, being their friend. Hooray. I think with the work that I do, which is rebranding, it's a really big business decision and it's a really big sort of celebratory moment for them. So I want to remember that that's what I'm being a part of, right?
Yeah,
These
yeah.
joyful moments with them. And pretty, because, what I want to make pretty things. And I've got to make sure that it's driving that stuff and it's smart, but that it's pretty too.
I love it. Okay, that I really
Yeah.
appreciate you sharing that because it's a nice
Yeah.
reflection on kind of how you think. And I have to say, I love the direction you were going, talking about the significance of words and how that should relate to decision making. I talk about this
Mm-hmm.
on the podcast when we discuss brand position and how brand position isn't just some random kind of pretty words that we just throw on the site for the sake of throwing on the site. That
Yeah.
really a brand position should represent how it is that we're spending most of our time as a business. This is what our brand is about. So pretty much everything should revolve around that. And I
Yeah.
like that you're echoing that because I think that's really, really important. There should be some intention behind the words that we choose for our brand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Totally. Totally. And then you could kind of lean on those words, right? Like I like to say that these are going to be your North Star guiding
Yeah,
you through it. Like when
absolutely.
you're like say that you have a business decision and you're like, oh, do I do this, right? You look back at your words and does it describe that and does it really reflect that? And it's a cheat sheet, right? And it's
Yep.
kind of nice to have that with you.
Yeah. Just a very quick question from YouTube.
Ooh.
This person says, "What if you're trying to from Tell It Well Photography? What if you're trying to aim for more of a higher income luxury audience?" And I'm not sure if this was directed toward copy or colors. Maybe you could
Mhm.
just briefly comment on both.
Yeah, so if you are, and one thing again that as we're talking about this personality and infusing yourself in it, make sure that you find within yourself a way to serve that luxury client and what that means to you,
Hmm.
right? So, when you're serving the luxury client, like that makes it seem like, oh yeah, they have money, which is great too, right? But how do you serve them and how do you fill a need for that market? Is it because your work is like gallery worthy, right? Or is it because you have an amazing attention to detail that they are going to love because that's what they expect from you? Understanding what it is that you bring to that particular market that you're trying to serve is going to help you with sort of the strategy bit of it, right? The back end part of it. The way that that can manifest in colors would be, look at other luxury brands. Don't just stay within your industry, but look at, what does Chanel look like? What does, fashion brands look like? What does luxury car services look like? And you'll
Yeah.
kind of get an idea of
Hmm.
that because you are competing for your customers, not just within your industry, but within that whole sort of tier, if you will.
That makes sense.
Right. Yeah. And then what was the other part we were talking
Well,
about with
just
like
luxury. So
keywords?
keywords
Yeah.
or copy, but then also
Mm-hmm.
colors. Does colors or how we choose colors affect,
Mm-hmm.
or is it affected, I should say, by the market that we're going after?
I think it depends, right? Because the market is, a big sort of generic way that we're kind of seeing a particular, like, is it income level that we're looking at? Is it a
Hmm.
particular lifestyle we're looking at? And so understanding very specifically who within that luxury market and why that luxury market, and then also who you are within that luxury market is really going
Mm.
to sort of drive that.
I have a lot of respect, Lisa, for the
Oh,
theme that you've brought to our conversation today, which is intentionality. And in some ways, I guess it's kind of a cliche word that gets thrown around, but I've just not heard a lot of it in conversations around branding. So I love that
hmm.
you bring that as a focus and as a priority to the conversation because it would be very easy again just to kind of be pretty and throw some nice words and some pretty colors and some pretty photos and then just hope that it sticks, but actually thinking about why it is we're doing what we're doing in the case of going after a high-end client, what it is that we actually bring, what value proposition we actually bring to that market, and actually being able to speak to that. The level of intentionality that you brought to the conversation, I think, is super important. I also think that you're just a really good teacher. And so, by the way, for anybody listening in, Lisa didn't ask me to do this, but I'd love, Lisa, for you just to share briefly the kind of consultation services that you offer to the photography industry or just business owners in general when it comes to branding. What kind of services do you offer?
Oh, thank you. They're so nice. Yeah, so I do a full service branding. So what I do is I, take what your business is, and I try to glean, what your brand vision would be, and then how that reflects into your branding design. So I do a full service logo suite, color, fonts, understanding what that design looks like, as well as ways to implement that in your business, and then also website design as well. So just kind of making sure that you look the part and that you look the way that you should look and that it's perfectly you.
Cool. And we'll, of course, make sure to link to your website in the show notes, ElletteStudio.com, Elette Studio on Instagram. And Tell It Well Photography kind of sums up our conversation well. They said, thank you so much for the great response. And really, this is such practical advice, very easy to listen to and follow. And I really appreciate you making time to share with all our listeners today. This has been really nice.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for having me. It was so much fun.
Well, and again, for everybody listening in, for those watching as well, make sure that you go to Elette, and I've got this up on the screen, ElletteStudio.com, and then follow Lisa as well, Elette Studio. Yeah, right over there. You got it. That's perfect. Thanks again, Lisa. I really appreciate it. Everybody have a wonderful day.
Have a good one.